Good afternoon to everyone joining from across the world. I'm happy to welcome you to Network 2020's briefing on the Iranian elections, the outlook and the impact. My name is Philip Sasek. I'm the Deputy Director at Network 2020. And for those who are joining us for the first time, I would just like to introduce Network 2020. We are an inclusive international community that bridges the gap between the private sector and foreign policy world. We achieve that by developing innovative research and identifying solutions that impact foreign policy challenges. With that said, I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today. I have to apologize in advance to perhaps cutting short some of their extensive experience, but we definitely have all of their bios available on our websites for those attendees who are interested in reading more. Sanam Vakil, she is the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa program at Chatham House, where she leads the future dynamics in the Gulf Project and the Iran Forum. Her research focuses on Middle Eastern security, Gulf geopolitics, and on future trends in Iran's domestic and foreign policy. She has held various academic positions, and she is an author and regularly publishes various research papers and comments for news outlets. Dr. Trita Parsi, he is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and an expert on US-Iran relations, Iranian foreign politics, and geopolitics of the Middle East. He has authored several books, and he is the founder of the National Iranian American Council. Dr. Parsi has also held various academic positions, and he has published numerous articles and is a regular commentator for various news outlets. Tara Kangarlou, she is an award-winning journalist who has reported, written, and produced for CNN, NBC, Huffington Post, Al Monitor, and Al Jazeera. He has previously served as a fellow at the East-West Institute, and her most recently published book, The Heartbeat of Iran, and my colleague Brian has kindly shared the link to the book if any of our attendees are interested in the book itself, that actually captures the complex realities of life in today's Iran. Tara has extensive experience in working on issues related to humanitarian and refugee issues, and along those lines, she launched a nonprofit organization called The Art of Hope, which focuses on helping Syrian refugees. To that end, I really would like to set the stage for today's conversation. And in order to gain a broader perspective of the impact of the upcoming Iranian elections in June, Sanam, I will turn to you for the first question. If you could share with us your insights on what is the significance on the elections on the socioeconomic environment in Iran, given the various contemporary challenges.
Thank you, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and back on Network 2020's call. Thank you for having me, and it's good to see Trita and Tara, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. This is a hugely consequential election for Iran. It's its 13th election in 42 years, and coming on the back of Iran's COVID crisis that has been through various and quite severe waves, that has added immense pressure to Iran's economy, that has also been suffering from a barrage of sanctions that began in under the Trump administration, and over that period of time, Washington imposed over 1,500 designations of Iran's companies and entities, and this, of course, has trickled down and impacted ordinary Iranians. This election is important because it's coming after 8 years of pragmatic centrist presidency of Hassan Rouhani, who campaigned on the Iran nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA. That agreement, despite Iranian compliance, was made vulnerable by the US withdrawal from the agreement. And here we are 8 years later with Iran's population being quite frustrated, disaffected from politics, heavily impacted by the burden of sanctions and economic downturn. And we have witnessed also over the past few years, growing trends of public apathy amidst, of course, greater coercive governmental control, greater repression against activists and journalists throughout the society. So when Iran goes to vote on June 18th, and we're still sort of waiting to see who the final candidates are, whether Iranians choose to vote or not will impact the outcome, but will also say something about how invested Iranians are in the politics of the country today.
Thank you, Sanam. In order to build upon some of the internal dynamics in Iran, Sanam, that you just introduced, turning to you, if you can take us now to the regional level and share your insights on how you believe the election outcomes might affect regional geopolitics.
Sorry, Philip, was that question for me?
Yes.
Yeah. There are some very interesting things happening in the region right now. I do not know, however, to what extent the election outcome will necessarily either derail or intensify those trends. Those trends are driven by some very clear strategic imperatives by the countries in the region. And as a result, there may be some complicating factors if you end up having a government in Iran that is far less interested in diplomacy and believes that it will have a more effective way of advancing its interests on the battlefield and using asymmetric warfare, etc. But I find that somewhat unlikely. I think it's more likely that even a conservative hardline government will try to cash in on some of the developments in the region, some of it that actually are a direct result of the fact that the United States and Iran did 6 years ago sign the JCPOA. But if we look at the factors that I think are mainly driving what is happening in the region, and part of the reason why I don't think they're necessarily going to be derailed by the election results, is the fact that the United States has now increasingly signaled, to the point that it's become convincingly signaling, that its focus is shifting away from the Middle East. Numerous presidents have said this in the past, that this is what they want to do. Very little evidence have been put forward that they really have enacted on that. What we saw now with Biden bringing troops home from Afghanistan, sending a very, very different signal to the Saudis, making clear that the war in Yemen has to end, withdrawing the blank check that MBS enjoyed and heavily utilized during the Trump years, I think has caused a major rethink in numerous capitals in the region. When they could hide behind American power, that was optimal if you were sitting in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, compared to engaging in diplomacy with the Iranians that clearly was going to be tricky. You would be forced to give some very painful concessions. So it wasn't particularly attractive. But now when the option of being able to hide behind American power does not seem to exist, it has created a greater symmetry of interest in which all of the different states see certain degrees of benefit in engaging diplomatically. So precisely because of that, I find it unlikely that the election result will dramatically change that picture.
Thank you, Trita. And Sanam, knowing that you have done extensive research on also the geopolitical level of the region, if you want to add anything to that question, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Philip. I agree very much with what Trita says, that the seeming departure of the U.S. From the region, or the distraction of the U.S. And the clear deprioritization of the Middle East is, of course, a huge driver in the back channel and bilateral relationships that are quietly developing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also broadly with other Arab states, including Egypt and Jordan and the UAE, which has been already far ahead of everybody else. I think, though, we shouldn't at the same time make too much of the talks, because they're still very nascent, they're very early days, and the laundry list of security issues that have to be discussed is long. And the mistrust, the gulf of mistrust is huge. I think it's important to be supportive of the dialogue, and I think the commitment of both sides is definitely there, because the Iranian leadership has clearly empowered multiple representatives to be involved and supportive of those talks. Oftentimes you hear Gulf Arab leaders suggest that the executive branch or elected members of the Iranian political establishment are not empowered to make these big, broad security decisions. And in the talks in Baghdad, we do know that intelligence officials and members of the IRGC have been present. So this suggests that there is a positive intent, but I think that there is a long way to go, and it's very still quite murky. We don't know who is offering what and what the terms are, but it's important that there are steps towards dialogue. That detente is something that I think is in all countries' interest, particularly again because of COVID. It's been a great leveler economically speaking. And we also know that Gulf Arab states are trying to prioritize economic interests. And for Saudi Arabia, with Vision 2030 having been made vulnerable over the past few years, and regional stability really also feeding in and damaging the regional economies, particularly in 2019 when Saudi oil facilities were attacked. This repositioning, I think, could also suggest that domestic priorities are coming into play here. So that is important to consider as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. And maybe if we just circle back a little bit to the internal structures of Iran, Tara, turning to you, and given your recently published book, The Heartbeat of Iran, you have conducted over hundreds of interviews on the ground. And that's one perspective that unfortunately we are not as exposed to as we are to some of the much larger geopolitical questions. From your research, what are some of the reactions and expectations of the Iranian people amidst the elections? Tara? We might have lost Tara. If that is the case, Sanam and Trita, I will just continue onwards, and we can circle back to this question once we have Tara back. Trita, you mentioned the realities in the region. Tara, hi. Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Tara, I don't know if you heard my question, but really kind of circling back to some of the internal dynamics, and given your recently published book, The Heartbeat of Iran, you have conducted hundreds of interviews on the ground. What are some of the reactions and expectations of Iranian people amidst the elections?
Thank you, Philip. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. And I always say that my internet somehow tends to be better in the region than the US, so I apologize for that. But like you mentioned, I spent the last couple of years working on my book, and as a result, have spoken to many Iranians from different walks of life. And I think it's important to understand the many voices that exist in Iran if you want to have a comprehensive understanding of the domestic challenges that exist in this country. As you know, I often say Iran is a country of 80 million human beings, not 80 million nuclear heads. And unfortunately, the window into Iran is very much through news headlines and the insular narratives that we have. But the people right now are completely disillusioned with the domestic challenges and the sort of domestic dynamics that exist in the country, and more I think right now we have a situation where the incompetency of the regime and the government has been unmasked for all factions of the society, even those from within the supporting apparatus, within the groups that were pro-regime are now wondering what's next. And I think that's quite interesting. And we are going to see how that's going to play out in the upcoming election. I think recently I did a piece on on how people are reacting to the talks in Vienna in comparison to 2015, where even the most disillusioned of people were excited about the possibility of a nuclear deal and the JCPOA. But right now, no one is excited on the street. People are so busy with their day-to-day struggles and efforts to make ends meet. I mean, you have to understand that the average laborer in Iran has a salary of $160 a month. And for a country that prices are equal to dollars, that just doesn't make sense for the average person. But also what I have always found fascinating with Iranians from, again, all walks of life is that they're some of the most incredible and resilient folks that you would find, and they have evolved to be resilient amidst all domestic and international pressure, and that's what you see on the ground right now. But people are frustrated. People are incredibly wary of where their next meal is coming from, and I think that economic and financial pressure is also felt within the dynamics that the regime has planned and is sort of thinking about as people go to the polls in 2-3 weeks' time.
Thank you, Tara. And I think you raise several important areas, especially when it comes to the realities on the ground. We typically on the outside hear about Iran's geopolitical aspect in the region and its objectives. But when it comes to those socioeconomic plans and strategies some of the candidates have, Sanam, I'm going to turn to you. If you can comment on some of the current candidates and if they have presented strategies that are trying to provide some type of path forward in dealing with the crippling effects of the sanctions, and of course, as Tara outlined, some of the difficulties the normal people in Iran are facing.
Sure, thank you, Philip. Well, to be very honest, it's still early days. The candidates had a number of days to register, and that period has ended. And right now, the Guardian Council, the body that is charged with vetting candidates, is culling a short list, and they will sort of reveal who has made the cut, and how you make the cut is sort of determined by your loyalty to the system, support for the supreme leader, their sort of age-related credentials. This year, they added experience, administrative experience, and elected capability kind of credentials to the package. And we don't know who is going to be put forward but we can sort of venture a guess. So let me sort of wade into that murky water. We Iran analysts try no longer to predict because it's always quite unpredictable, but there are top number of candidates that are insiders, establishment candidates, like the current head of the judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi. He ran in 2017 against Rouhani. He lost, which wasn't a surprise, but he did win 16 million votes. So he is being portrayed as a conservative favorite. And if what will be important to watch is if other conservatives sort of coalesce around Raisi and drop out and support this sort of consensus candidate, which we haven't really seen in past elections. Too often conservatives have been divided. So he is currently the favorite. Ahmadinejad, who was a controversial president from 2005 to 2013 has also, of course, put himself forward. He is not expected to pass Guardian Council vetting, he's, I think, got a huge dossier on the Iranian deep state and people close to the supreme leader. So he's quite a controversial candidate. He's threatened, though, and this is where it gets interesting, that if he doesn't pass the vetting, that he will boycott and call on his supporters to boycott. Now, Ahmadinejad, despite his reputation abroad, is a populist and a nationalist and an opportunist, if you will, and he is got quite a degree of support inside the country. So I think, if he was vetted, he would be quite competitive. So if he does boycott and calls on his supporters to boycott, that could draw down public participation further. And we're expecting popular participation to be quite low. Reformists are running a few candidates, but I think that the reformist camp is really in a crisis post this 8 years with Rouhani at the helm, but also reformists have captured municipal, local councils. They did have quite a degree of representation in parliament before last year's parliamentary elections. So it's unclear which reformists will come ahead. Rouhani's Vice President Jahangiri will most likely pass vetting, but it's unlikely that reformist candidates will win a big majority of the vote, because there is also a push for reformists to boycott. And the final candidate that's worthwhile mentioning is Ali Larijani, who has been a very influential figure within the system, close to the supreme leader. His family is hugely important. His brother was the former judiciary chief. So, there are a lot of big characters contesting this office, but this election is important not just for who wins, but also because if a conservative wins, then conservatives will sort of dominate both the formally elected institutions in Iran and the unelected institutions. And this comes at a critical juncture where the supreme leader is quite old, and whoever is in the executive will be important to help shepherd through a succession and political transition process.
Thank you, Sanam. And really kind of thinking about the potential candidates, and of course, we don't need to speculate too much on the possible outcomes. But, when it comes to that actual shift in the path of Iran's foreign policy in the region, how much do you expect could change, and who will actually, what is the effect of the supreme leader in terms of setting that path forward? There have been numerous tensions in the last few weeks and months in the Gulf. How much actual impact will the new president have when it comes to foreign policy in relations with the path that it has already been set by the supreme leader?
No, it's quite fascinating when you study Iran's foreign policy over the decades, and not just over the decades of the Islamic Republic. There is a remarkable degree of continuity, and there's, of course, a tremendous amount of change as well. Between presidents, of course, there's less of that change and more of that continuity. But I think it's important to recognize that, the difference it makes, for instance, for the United States to be able to negotiate with a Javad Zarif and a Hassan Rouhani compared to the tremendous challenges they had negotiating with an Ahmadinejad and a Saeed Jalili. It makes a big difference. It makes a big difference about the rhetoric that they use. I think it's quite fascinating how quiet Rouhani was throughout the negotiations when it comes to rhetoric on Israel, for instance, and particularly when you contrast that to what Ahmadinejad said. And I think it was very clear because he really wanted to get a nuclear deal, and he quite well understood that if you want to get a nuclear deal, you cannot continue with that same rhetoric on Israel because it creates unnecessary complications and reduces the political will that needs to be mustered by the United States to come to such an agreement. So it definitely does make a difference. And for the negotiations with the region, for the negotiations with the P5 or the P4 plus one, and potentially the US as well, it will very much make a difference if the next president of Iran uses that same rhetoric, comes with that approach, or if it is a president that understands that at the end of the day, if you truly want to get a deal, you have a responsibility to try to reduce the political cost of the other side to agree to the compromises that you're seeking. And this, of course, is very well true for the US side or any side in this negotiation. So, but going back to your questions about the continuity and change, I think the factors that will drive this more than anything else is the consensus within the foreign policy elite, which will shift somewhat, but will not shift dramatically as a result of this election. Some of those voices will be taken out, some of them will remain. And as a result, there may be a slight shift, but that shift compared to the context, meaning the strategic context that Iran finds itself in based on the developments in the region, it's really difficult in my view to point to those internal developments in Iran as being more decisive than when it comes to the regional changes that are taking place that I think will essentially overshadow whatever differences and shifts can take place inside of Iran.
Thank you, Trita. Tara, turning to you for one of the very important aspects of Iran, given its large youth population, we've seen waves of change and young people demanding things to change dramatically within the roots of various socio-political systems. If you can share with us what you think the role of the youth is in Iran and what level of political engagement and education do they have? The Supreme Leader mentioned within one of his speeches made 10 days ago that he wants to see many more young people involved in the new administration. So how are young people positioning themselves vis-a-vis specific engagement with a possible and future new administration?
Thanks, Philip. I think the issue of youth is incredibly important when thinking and talking about Iran. With regards to the Supreme Leader's speech about the youth, it's interesting because he came out again a few days later and I wouldn't say corrected himself, but added more context because there was some misinterpretation about what he means about a young administration. Rather, he clarified and he ended up focusing on this issue of development, this issue that we need to evolve, and added context as to what he means by youth. And with that, he means, he said that he's interested in evolving the values of the revolution into what people and the youth can use to carry on this helm and this torch. And so with the principles of the revolution, he seems to be interested in what can be carried and delivered in the coming sort of years and decades. And can you guys hear me okay? Philip?
Yes, we can hear you, Tara.
So, great. So with that, he added this context. But, Philip, when you look at the youth, I think it's wise to not look at the Iranian youth through a sort of categorical lens. You have an interesting young and vibrant dynamic among young people who are supporters of folks like Ahmadinejad. These are diehard revolutionaries, a lot of them in rural communities, in religious factions of the society, that are the folks who come on the streets and chant the death to America and death to Israel slogans. And these are the young people that you see on the streets. They are allowed influential clout, but a small part of the society. I mean, again, Iran has 80 million in population, has more than 50 million eligible voters right now, by the way. And so the young people that you would see in the Friday prayers, they are young, they are vibrant, but they're not representative of the youth of this country. Now, with that said, you have young, very educated Iranians, men and women, who are college educated, who are struggling again financially as a result of host of economic issues, and are struggling to find jobs. Unemployment is soaring, and as a result, you see a wave of migration. I mean, it's worth saying that this past year, as a result of Corona, you've seen an influx exodus of nurses and physicians and medical professionals leaving the country. So among this large, educated, young group in Iran, you have soaring apathy, disillusionment, the aspirations to leave the country, and sort of this brain drain that continues to take place. Mentioning that for that group, for those young people who see themselves separate than the regimes, who are anti, establishment, the incompetency of this regime has unmasked, and they have no in the government as is. And there's a rope right now in Iran that says, in order for the government to bring people, especially young people, to the streets, they're going to give out free vaccines. So that's how little these young people take the government seriously. And I think that's very telling of the general consensus. So coming back to your question, I think it's important to distinguish between the different groups that exist within the young and vibrant Iranian society.
Thank you, Tara. And what we will do now is we'll switch over to our Q&A. And just as a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box. I see a lot of questions, so I hope we'll have enough time to answer all of your questions. But perhaps we can start with the first question from Hari Krishna. And that is, what are the impacts or the repercussions of Iran's nuclear arsenal after the election? And also his second question is, how will this election impact the Iran-China joint investment bankers? Trita, would you perhaps want to start with this one? And of course, Sanam, Tara, with questions, feel free to chime in with thoughts.
Thank you for the question. One point of clarification, the Iranians do not have a nuclear arsenal in the sense of having nuclear weapons. They have no weapons. They do have a stockpile of low-enriched uranium, which according to the JCPOA could not exceed 400 kilograms, but because the United States withdrew from the agreement and eventually the Iranians started to reduce their obligations, that stockpile now I think has reached 2,500 kilos, which would be sufficient for two nuclear weapons, but they don't have weapons, they have the material. They've also started enriching at 20% and at 60%. We don't know yet exactly what their stockpile of that is. That will be affected based on whether there is a JCPOA revival before the next president takes office. It seems increasingly unlikely that there will be an agreement before the Iranian elections on June 18th. But even if it doesn't happen before June 18th, there is still a bit of a window, a month and a half or so before the next president of Iran takes office, in which the negotiations could continue, could be implemented. It would be the last move by Rouhani, essentially, and he would own it. And the next president of Iran would essentially be able to say that whatever positives or negatives comes with that, he essentially inherited that from the previous president. But if that does not happen, and the negotiations falter and it is left to the next president of Iran to negotiate it, then I think we will be in a much, much trickier situation, much more difficult than it already is. The next president will probably feel all kinds of pressure of proving himself, and unfortunately, most likely it will be himself. It's unclear as to whether the Guardian Council will allow women to run. But it will feel pressure on himself to outdo the previous administration and prove himself to be tougher and harder and a better negotiator. Moreover, the current negotiators know each other quite well. They spent a lot of time negotiating the JCPOA 6 years ago. And as a result, there wasn't much of a reconnecting that was needed. If you have a complete shift of the teams that are going to be handling this, then that also is going to cause a significant loss of time and complicate matters further. And the longer it drags on, the more difficult it will be for both sides to feel that this is worthwhile. Particularly on the American side, there's a lot of nervousness because The JCPOA has certain time schedules written into it. For instance, in 2023, 2 years from now, the United States is scheduled to lift sanctions on Iran in Congress. We're no longer talking about the president using sanctions waivers, but actually having an affirmative vote in Congress to lift the sanctions. The Iranians need to, at the same time, ratify the additional protocol in their parliament. But that is 2023, a year before the next presidential elections. And I cannot remember the last time the United States Congress actually voted to lift any sanctions. Almost all the sanctions relief that we have seen when it comes to Cuba, Myanmar, etc., were all done through executive action. So it's going to take a dramatic amount of political capital to get through that process. And the longer we wait with actually getting back into the JCPOA, the less there is a likelihood that the two sides can then renegotiate that time frame and push that forward. The Iranians have so far shown zero willingness of doing so. And if the US side then comes to the conclusion that it simply will not be able to push forward that deadline, and I'm just mentioning one of the examples of the deadline, we may very well come into a situation in which the political cost is deemed to be too high compared to the political benefits.
Thank you, Trita. Sanam, Tara, if you have any thoughts to add to that, please feel free to do so. If not, we can move on to our next question from Makam. And Makam is interested in to what extent do you think that the changing leadership will impact the bilateral relationship between Iran and China?
Did I take that?
Sanam, sure, please.
Sure. What has been sort of an interesting outcome of this period of maximum pressure has been sort of a growing discussion within the Iranian political establishment about ties with Europe versus ties with Asia. This has, of course, been an ongoing discussion, but there has been deep frustration, if not disappointment, since President Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, that Europe hasn't done more to save the deal, to protect the deal. Mind you, they have tried their best to protect the deal, but from Iran's perspective, the fact that European companies have withdrawn from the Iranian market, that Europe hasn't been able to step in or hasn't been willing to provide economic incentives towards Iran, as was promised by the JCPOA, has created this sort of deep disillusionment about Europe. And there's been significant criticism within conservative camps from the Supreme Leader itself that, Europe can't be trusted and is effectively no different to the United States in sort of seeking to pressure Iran or to move the goalposts on negotiations. And it's in this context, and again, this isn't new. Iran has had long-standing relations with China going back decades, but this 25-year Iran-China agreement has been, the news of it was made public. Of course, we still don't know all of the details, but there are, of course, political factions in Iran that are more supportive of this orientation, seeing the Chinese economic model that promotes economic liberalization while maintaining the security of the political establishment as an ideal model for the Islamic Republic. Now, within Iranian society, there is not a consensus that the China model is best or that the Chinese economic relationship is best for Iran. I think that there is a debate with Iranians oftentimes being frustrated by the quality of Chinese products or being naturally more oriented towards European products and European technology. But China, it's important to consider China's role here. China doesn't intervene in the domestic politics of any country that it has relationships with, except for Taiwan and those in its close vicinity. And that is also attractive for Iran. It feels like it can trust the Chinese, but the Chinese actually have relationships with many Middle Eastern countries, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Algeria. They all have the sort of same model of a comprehensive strategic relationship with China. So China isn't going to sort of wade in and pick Iran over these other relationships. So it's important to see these growing economic ties is important as Iran tries to dig itself out of sanctions and rebuild its economy. But at the same time, let's also not overstate it. This relationship isn't going to be the be-all and end-all of Iran. And I think ultimately the Iranian economy needs a diversified set of relationships, not one country that is going to save Iran or be an investor for the Iranian economy either.
If I could just add one thing, Philip.
Absolutely, Trita.
I think Sanam is absolutely correct. It would be very dangerous to overstate that agreement. And I think while some have interpreted it and some have portrayed it as an effort by the Iranians to shift towards China, I think this was actually more a calculation by the Iranians that if they have this agreement with the Chinese, they're in actually better negotiating position vis-a-vis the Europeans in the hope of actually making sure that they can get something with the Europeans. I don't see them deliberately wanting to go into just the Chinese direction and completely forsake any opportunities with the West, even though, as Sanam correctly pointed out, the disappointment with the Europeans is immense on the Iranian side. I think they do understand that the Europeans had their own headaches with Trump administration, but there were at times proposals, loans and other things, and back payments on oil, etc. That, you know, an idea of being able to pay for the oil now, get it delivered later on when the sanctions are lifted, and none of them actually were implemented because at the end of the day, the European calculation was that it would be too politically costly for them, and that I think really crystallized the view in Iran, which I think we will see now in the forthcoming negotiations, that the Europeans essentially are a mere extension of the United States, dealing with them as a separate entity, as a mediator, etc., is not likely in the manner that it was done before. Although the Iranians seem to view the EEAS rather differently than the E3.
Thank you, Trita. And that's definitely, I see a lot of questions regarding some of the bilateral relations and kind of future development. Before we get to those, Tara, I'm going to jump in with a question for you. The question is, you mentioned that people in Iran are not excited given that they're dealing with much more immediate struggles. What is the general sentiment about the future of US-Iran relations among those people? And are they hopeful that there will be better diplomacy moving forward with a new candidate and a new president in place?
Iranians are very well aware that a conservative president would not mean any improvement of relations between the U.S. and Iran. But if you talk to ordinary Iranians, they are able to distinguish between the government in the U.S. and the people, and I think that's something that in the U.S. we fail to do. And on the ground, Iranians are very much connected to the world in a sense that they're westernized, if you want to call it, because of the use of internet. And so while the country is isolated, they have found ways to connect to the rest of the world amidst the isolation. So they want to belong to the international community. They want to be part of this sort of global family.
You are
the ordinary Iranian. I think people have realized and found out that their livelihood and their ability to make ends meet and have financially viable life has little to do with these talks, any prospects of diplomatic relations, because they know that that's not possible, and they know that inherently the regime in Iran is not in favor of that. And one thing I would add to the issue on China is quite interesting, because if you look domestically, the Iranian regime and the Iranian government can bet on this idea that they can throw bones toward this financially disillusioned, population saying that China is a win because ideologically they cannot do that with the U.S. So anytime there is any sort of of rapprochement with Europe or the U.S., whether it be the JCPOA or any trade agreement, domestically the Islamic regime cannot wave the flag because inherently it's against their disciplines that is anti-West. Whereas China and any relations with China doesn't have that narrative attached to it. So the government in Iran very much bets on waving their flag whenever they have developed or work on developing any ties with countries like China, that they can essentially run around and promote domestically and try to win within the population, which obviously is very hard right now. But relations with the U.S., Iranian people, ordinary Iranians, obviously are in favor of that, but they're very well aware that that's not something that can be achieved, at least in the short term.
Thank you, Tara. I actually have a question here that is focusing on the ongoing situation and conflict between Hamas and Israel from David Corey. His question is, what impact might the current conflict between Hamas and Israel have on the election? Might it strengthen hardliners and people like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who has stated that he would like to run again? Trita, do you want to take a shot?
I don't think this will have any impact whatsoever on the elections. This is not a main concern of the Iranian population in any stretch of the imagination. It will be used as a political football in the campaign, however, and we've already seen that. Foreign Minister Zarif was supposed to be in Vienna, but because of the raising of the Israeli flag at one of the buildings over there, some of the hardliners put pressure on him and he delayed or canceled that trip. So you will see this issue being used as a political football, but in the manner that it actually would have much of an impact on the elections or impact on the population's desire to come out and vote or not vote, I don't really seeing it being a factor.
Sanam, do you want to add anything?
I don't think it's a factor in the elections, but if I could just use it to segue into sort of broader problems, with all eyes on Vienna, the reason why the JCPOA, I mean, there are many reasons why the JCPOA and rehabilitating it is important, but the violence in Gaza and with Israel really speaks to sort of the broader regional challenges that lay before us. And the JCPOA being resolved, I think is a first step to being able to address some of those broader regional challenges. It's important for partners of the United States that are deeply concerned that a rehabilitation of the JCPOA will lead to sort of a return of what we saw in 2015 onwards, where from their perspective, Iran increased its regional power and its regional footprint and relationships with non-state actors. But it's also important for the Iranians. If regional issues are not addressed this time around, the JCPOA will be forever vulnerable to regional pressure. And so effectively, I think regional states are locked in this vicious circle of a crisis. If the United States and the international community do not invest in de-escalating and managing the multitude of regional conflicts from Israel, Palestine to Syria, to Iraq and Yemen, all of these states risk being dragged down, and the United States also risks being dragged back in to the Middle East when it also seeks to focus on broader geopolitical and also domestic issues.
Sanam, and we have recently just mentioned more than a few times the role of the European Union within the entire dynamic between the United States and Iran. Arlette Laurent has a question regarding the EU special purpose vehicle. Do you think that if the US would allow Europe to use such mechanism, would that facilitate further trade between Europe and Iran? And would that signal or that allowance have a beneficial impact on the electoral decision-making process in Iran?
Is that for me?
Yes, please. Please.
Trita, do you want to take this one, or
I didn't hear half the question, so.
Okay, it was about Instax and dynamics with the Europeans, and if that can impact the electoral outcomes.
Again, no, I don't think so. I don't think the population has any particular hope or confidence. I think there's been a significant degree of apathy and cynicism that has developed over the very idea of a deal, a JCPOA. I mean, we can't forget there was massive turnout for the reformists and the centrists in 2013. In Tehran, for instance, they took all of the city positions in the city council. They did so in almost all of the major cities of the United States. So there was a very strong wave of centrists and reformists in that election. And the Rouhani government put almost all of its eggs in the JCPOA basket, really promising that if the relations with the United States could be resolved, so much positive could come. A large part of the population believed in this, but then seeing not only what happened during the Trump years in which the US reversed and actually imposed more sanctions on Iran, and put Iran in this rather bizarre situation in which it was under more sanctions once it was in the JCPOA than when it was before the JCPOA had been negotiated. But also the fact that in the last year and a half of the Obama administration, the sanctions relief really did not work out as well as any party had envisioned. And the US actually did quite a lot to try to make it work out. But the problem with the sanctions is that the sanctions are not just a piece of legislation. That's one component of it. The other component is the reputational risk and the fear factor. The sanctions were designed in such a way that the actual law is somewhat ambiguous and unclear. And then you combine that with astronomical fines if you break them. What that does is that it causes any legal department in any company, when they look at this, they draw the conclusion, it's just better to stay away from this because we can't figure out what you can and cannot do. And if we're wrong, we're going to be hit with astronomical fines. Now, once the sanctions are lifted, it does not mean that that fear and that hesitation is automatically gone. That lingers on for quite some time. And it did during the first year and a half after the JCPOA when Obama was still in power. So a lot of the expectations were never fulfilled, and some of those expectations may have been exaggerated by the Rouhani government themselves. But given all of that, you're not in a situation right now in which the belief or the idea that a deal with the West is going to make a massive change is particularly impactful on the population, because I think they become, if not cynical, somewhat disillusioned by that prospect altogether.
Thank you, Trita. Moving on for a question for Tara, especially Tara, because you have conducted a lot of interviews. Patricia Navarre is interested, what is the role and what is the participation of women these days in the upcoming elections?
Great question. The women actually have been very politically active, even though they're not going to be able to run for a presidency. As far as being voters and being active voices on various levels of the society, women are active. But then again, fundamentally, this upcoming election comes at a time where people are incredibly disillusioned, and there's an enormous amount of apathy among people. And I don't think there's a difference between the male turnout or female turnout. Pretty much people are incredibly disillusioned. So we are not going to see ordinary, educated, secular people on the streets the way we saw, in the last election in 2017, for example. And I want to make a distinction here. When you talk to Iranians and you speak with voters who have voted for folks like Rouhani, centrist candidates, or even reformists, they do so with the knowledge that these people are coming from the establishment. They're part of the regime, and they do that in order to prevent a win for conservatives like those folks such as Raisi or Larijani. And that's why you see such vibrant turnouts in certain elections, because people want to choose between, they say, you know, bad and worse. They want to choose the lesser evil, and really that's the reason behind the voter turnout in Iran, because they don't want to see the hardliners in power. But again, this election comes at a time where there's so much apathy, there's so much financial and economic challenges domestically. People have lost their jobs. People, in some cases, have to work 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, and women are fighting, you know, alongside men, and you know, the whole society as a whole is dealing with fundamental challenges. So no, I don't think you're going to see a huge voter turnout, you know, whether it be among women or men.
Thank you, Tara. And one of the questions that I see in the Q&A is going back to the JCPOA. And Francis is asking a question along the lines of, what is the most likely scenario? A deal that will mirror the 2015 JCPOA, a deal that is less comprehensive, or a deal that goes further and includes regional and other issues? Maybe if there's a way that we can include this within the scope of some of the statements made by some of the candidates for president, if such statements have been made. Sanam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. First of all, I think it's important. We don't know who's running, who is going to pass through vetting. So it's hard to, and these candidates have yet to make policy pronouncements. So May 21st is when the announcement of the shortlist will be released. And then from May 21st to June 18th, the candidates will have a period of time to run and present their various policies. More often than not, there are not such deep dives in prescriptive policies that are laid out. There are sort of debates on different alignments and positions, and so it will be interesting if in this election there is a much more of a deep dive on policy issues. And you know, within the system, for the time being, the Supreme Leader has very much empowered the Rouhani administration to continue the JCPOA negotiations. I agree with Trita, it doesn't look likely that we will have any sort of agreement before the elections, but this empowerment of the establishment could mean that after the elections are resolved, some sort of negotiation could be arrived at, and this could benefit whoever does win the elections. They could sort of reap the economic and sort of political gains of that outcome. I don't think that Vienna is going to produce a bigger, broader deal. From my understanding, all of the parties that are there are looking to restore the JCPOA, and perhaps at best make some improvements where the JCPOA was not meeting Iran's ability to access financial markets. I don't think the US government is going to allow Iran to, for example, access U-turn transactions in this current climate. There are things that people are going to hold back. And the reason why they have to hold back is because the objective is to get to a bigger, broader deal that Trita alluded to earlier. And that has to come further afield. There needs to be a broadening of the JCPOA itself. And then there needs to be an arrangement and a broader discussion on regional issues. And there need to be probably a mix of carrots and sticks and incentives offered to Iran and also other parties to participate in those sort of discussions. It's a really huge initiative. So it will be a really important that the JCPOA as it is preserved as a first step, and those other issues addressed further along the line.
Thank you, Sanam. And perhaps the last question, because unfortunately we do not have any more time, is coming from Joanna. And the question is basically focusing on the role of the Revolutionary Guard within contemporary politics in Iran. Is there any role that the military itself plays within elections and possible election outcomes? Trita, do you want to take that question?
Actually, I would love to hear Tara's answer to that based on her interviews on the ground there.
Thank you. It's interesting. You know, the IRGC plays a role behind the curtain. You don't see IRGC and the military have a front seat row when it comes to the election, but the conservative and the hardline candidates have a foot within the IRGC and the military apparatus one way or another. And you know, some candidates, whether it be this election or the previous elections, have been you know, generals within the IRGC, within the Sepah. So some of the candidates have a bolder foot coming from the IRGC apparatus, but some have indirect connections and ties within the IRGC. But when it comes to this election, again, people equate the hardliners and the conservatives to the IRGC. There's no distinctions for the people when it comes to these two groups. Now, some candidates have less ties, more ties, and some are sort of direct byproduct of that system. But again, there's no doubt that the IRGC is the most powerful faction in the you know, Iranian regime right now, and you know, they control some of the most powerful conglomerates in Iran, and they in ways have the final word on many things. And while they might not have again front row seat at the election publicly and visibly, on stage behind the curtains, they control pretty much all strings.
That and Trita, Sanam, Tara, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. Just two quick comments before we end today's discussion is our upcoming event, which takes place on Thursday, May 20th. Brian has kindly shared the details. If you scan the QR code, you'll be able to receive the RSVP link and read more information about the conversation itself. Lastly, we are a nonprofit organization. We're, of course, striving to maintain these conversations and discussions open and free to our global community. If you do have the ability to donate, we will, of course, greatly appreciate that. Once again, Trita, Sanam, Tara, and thank you so much for participating, and thank you so much for all the great questions from our attendees. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.